We are joined now by Abdullah Al-Arian. He is an analyst with the Palestinian policy network, al-shabaka. He joins me now live from Doha. Professor, good to see you. Good to have you here with us on TRT World. I want to start the discussion by focusing on the United States because lately the U.S. has become one of the focal points of this conflict, especially with the announcement of sending its aircraft carrier to the region. So given the U.S.'s past efforts with the Abraham Accords, how has this recent escalation in violence exposed any shortcomings in the approach when it comes to prioritizing diplomatic ties between Israel and regional Arab countries over direct peace efforts between Israelis and Palestinians?
Well, I mean, I think what we've seen over the last, almost a decade, really, is the United States, essentially conceding that it has no intention whatsoever to bring about any kind of relief or resolution for Palestinian national aspirations. And so I think we've seen this cemented really in the latter part of the Trump administration at a time when it was very clear that none of the agreements between Israel and any of the Arab states were intended to address any of the outstanding concerns, in particular, of course, the siege of Gaza, but also the massive expansion and land theft, an expansion of settlements that's happened in the West Bank, the violations in East Jerusalem, and so forth. And so a lot of these kinds of concerns were completely swept under the rug in a way that at least even prior administrations used to at least pay lip service to the idea of wanting to see some kind of resolution. And what we've seen more recently with the Biden administration is that they've essentially adopted the entire Trump strategy with regards to the question of Israel and Palestine. They've essentially wanted to double down on the number of agreements, particularly obviously seeing Saudi Arabia as a major achievement, were they to sign an agreement with Israel that doesn't address in any way, shape, or form the situation for the Palestinians. And so I think what this past few days have shown is that clearly the Palestine question has not gone anywhere. In fact, if anything, it's gotten far more dire, far more desperate. In particular, knowing that the siege is not simply something that began 2 days ago, but something that's been ongoing for 16 years. As we've seen, of course, there's been a massive intensification, both in terms of the parameters of the siege, but also in particular, given the massive onslaught of Israeli missiles and bombs that have fallen on Palestinian civilians, most of whom, of course, as has been mentioned repeatedly, are women and children, in a place where they simply have no shelter, nowhere to go. And of course, all of their medical facilities have been completely exhausted. There's been no outside aid that's been able to reach them whatsoever. And so in the light of all of this, it's even more stark to see that the United States has not said a single word about any of this, and in fact has only sent its military to the region as a way of
Why do you
kind
think
of
that is? What do you
bolstering.
think is holding the U.S. back?
Well, I mean, I think there are a number of considerations, but partly that this has been part and parcel of U.S. policy, which is to secure Israeli expansionism, has been very much part of U.S. policy for quite some time. There's never been any kind of a serious effort to try and mediate the solution between the two parties. I think the idea of an honest broker, of course, has been debunked considerably. And there are clearly strategic considerations for why the U.S. wants to do this. And clearly, there's no political will whatsoever. And in fact, if we're looking at the statements coming from every single political official, from the president on down through his administration, even local city mayors and state governors are all kind of in unison in terms of their incredibly callous dismissal of the humanitarian plight of Palestinians and their firm resolve in terms of standing behind and backing everything that Israel does in this moment, irrespective of the calls for genocide among some sectors of the Israeli political elite, and of course the massive violence that is becoming even more unprecedented than anything we've seen before.
Abdullah, you have very closely followed the situation developing between Israel and Palestine. Tell me, where do you think this is headed towards? What are we looking at?
Well, I think, as everyone has been saying, I mean, we're entering into uncharted waters. A lot of this is really unprecedented, because I think there's been a sense that the Palestinians have absolutely no agency whatsoever in terms of what's befallen them over the course of decades, and particular in the last kind of 10 or 15 years. And so now we're seeing a situation in which there's clearly an attempt to break out of the cycle that we've seen in terms of the continuous dispossession, the siege and blockade of Gaza. And a lot of these things now have to be addressed, and I think have to be taken seriously in a way that had been completely dismissed up to this point. So hopefully there will be, at some point, a recognition, particularly on the international level. I mean, I saw even among the headlines that you had there that the UN has said that the siege is contrary to international law, and yet it's been ongoing for 16 years. And so maybe this is the moment that there should be a recognition that the siege and the blockade should be lifted, and that the people of Palestine deserve, some recognition of their political and human rights as well.
Abdullah, very quickly, what is your navigation through the reaction of neighboring Arab countries?
Well, I mean, I think what we've seen from regimes is vastly different from what we've seen on the popular level. There's been tremendous outpouring of solidarity with what Palestinians are enduring at the moment. I think among the regimes, we've seen obviously a much more cagey and cautious response, in particular because most of those countries, in particular the ones that have already signed agreements, but also the ones that are in the process of trying to sign agreements with Israel, see that as being, contrary to their interest to endorse any kind of, humanitarian resolution for the plight of Palestinians. And so I think in that sense, we've seen a much more muted response, particularly as the death tolls in Gaza have been escalating by the hour. And at the same time, I think there's also a recognition that this is simply not the time for those countries and those regimes to be putting their interests first ahead of what we're witnessing currently.
Abdullah Al-Arian, thank you very much for talking to us here on TRT World. Really appreciate your taking out the time.